Day breaks in the vibrant economy of India. The hustle and bustle of daily life begins. Markets come alive early in the day, bursting with frenzied activity, while around them, commuters are scurrying to get to work. The traffic is a mess. But through all the mayhem, this age-old civilization, with its many challenges, is emerging as an economic force to contend with. Often referred to as an economic powerhouse, India has sustained rapid growth for the last 2 decades. During the recent global financial crisis, most countries of the world suffered. Stock markets fell, financial institutions collapsed, and even the wealthiest of the world's nations needed to be rescued. India, though it was affected by the crisis, recovered quickly.
The difference between other countries and India is that the recovery was very rapid. The impact was short-lived, and this was because of basically 2 things. One, the Reserve Bank of India put in place immediately stimulatory policies, and so did the government. The government got a bit lucky, if you wish. They had fiscal policies that were already stimulatory. That helped boost India's economy during the crisis. And that's one of the big reasons why it recovered as quickly as it did.
India's economy is primarily driven by domestic sources of growth, unlike its neighbors who rely heavily on exports. This benefited India during the crisis since it looked inward for sources of growth, which insulated the country from the wrath of the crisis.
We have experienced the worst financial crisis since the 30s. And frankly, I think everybody will agree that India has weathered remarkably well, thanks to sound macroeconomic and financial policy. Now, India's growth is among the highest in the world, and obviously this country is a driving force in the global recovery.
Positive growth is not a new phenomenon in India, since the country has sustained a healthy growth rate for the last 2 decades. What is the secret behind this economic success? Perhaps the answer lies in the lessons learned from its turbulent past. After gaining independence in 1947, India's economy was extensively regulated, protectionist, and as a result, growth was slow. India was able to turn its economy around in the early 90s by implementing free market principles and liberalizing government regulations. The dawn of the new century brought with it a decade of accelerated and sustained growth.
I think the inherent dynamism of the Indian economy again needs to be unleashed by reducing government regulations that have prevented Indian industries from actually realizing the dynamism, but at the same time maintaining effective regulation. And on many of these issues, India has struck its own path, not blindly copying lessons from the West, but I fear there is also a sense of insularity that still remains in India that needs to be gotten over. We need to be able to import the best ideas from abroad, adapt them to the Indian circumstances, but not allow ourselves to be held back by old notions of orthodoxy.
Today, India's economy is as diverse as the people that live in it. There are a number of occupations ranging from traditional village farming to modern industries. Though still famous for its booming film industry, India has reached star status in other areas too, such as the high-tech industry and the service industry.
India has followed a very different path of development relative to most other economies. The traditional path of development is where you go from being an agriculture-led economy to being heavy in terms of industry and then move into services. Now, India skipped that middle stage altogether and went straight from agriculture, and in fact agriculture is still very important for the economy, but services have become more important. Now, this is not necessarily a good thing. In large part, why this happened is because there were certain restraints in the Indian economy. So large industries in particular are subject to a lot of difficulties in terms of the operating environment. So almost by default, the services sector had to take on the burden of growth, and the services sector, which is much less tightly controlled in terms of labor market regulations or other government regulations, had the space to expand.
With so much emphasis being placed on the service sector, won't the growth in the other sectors be affected? Recently, there has been an urgent call by policymakers to rebalance global growth. But what does this rebalancing mean in the Indian context?
India is quite contrarian to other emerging economies in the sense that our drivers of growth have been largely domestic. Exports, for example, constitute only 15% of our GDP. So in terms of rebalancing, actually we should be going in the other direction, increasing our external sector, increasing our exports, for example, even as we continue to emphasize domestic drivers, that is private consumption and investment. The second rebalancing we have to do is to shift from services to manufacturing. As much as we continue to emphasize services, we need to place greater emphasis on the manufacturing sector for both creating jobs as well as reaching double-digit rates of growth.
There are imbalances in other areas of the economy as well. Roads are in disrepair, access to water and electricity is dismal, and mass transit abhorrent. One of the key ingredients to running the country more efficiently lies in developing its infrastructure and enhancing its financial structure.
For those people who visited India, they can see how poor the infrastructure is in many areas. And this is what's been holding up manufacturing. And I mean specifically electricity. You can't run a factory plant if you have 20 hours of brownouts or blackouts. And you have to generate your own power. It's very expensive, it's inefficient, it's damaging to the environment. Infrastructure has been described, including by me, as India's Achilles heel. You have difficulty in moving your goods from either the farm or your factory to the ports and airports, or to even towns and villages around you. So infrastructure is in fact the key focus of economic policy. Fortunately, this government has really seized on this and has made it a priority.
Adding to this laundry list of challenges is India's rate of inflation, which is the highest amongst emerging markets.
India is really kind of unique. The whole rest of the world is not really looking at strong inflation pressures, and in fact, in the advanced part of the world, we are looking even at deflation pressures. So what's going on in India then that's making inflation a problem? Two things. One, the cyclical recovery. This is a chronically supply-constrained economy. We have had for a long time stronger demand than supply, and supply typically takes longer to put in place. So we've had this chronic sort of excess demand situation. So in the course of the cycle, in a supply-constrained economy, price pressures tend to be exaggerated.
There's also the problem of high deficit and debt levels, leaving very little resources for India to spend on economic and social development. And then there's the issue of poverty and lack of education. A drive through any Indian city or its countryside brings to the forefront the abject poverty that still exists in India. Although there has been some decline in its poverty rate over the decades, the country still accounts for 1/3 of the world's poor.
India's key challenge is going to be to make sure that those at the margins of subsistence are being pulled out of poverty. China has managed to do this very effectively, pulling a very large proportion of its population out of poverty. In India, although the average growth rate has been very good, I think the fact that we've not been able to deal effectively with poverty is still a major issue.
Still a very large number, 400 million or so people. The gaps are actually widening, and that to my mind is a bigger concern than poverty per se, because if you look at the poverty numbers, they seem to be improving.
Despite all of its challenges, there's a sense of optimism that resonates through India. A driving force behind its dynamic economy is the growing number of youth entering its labor force. There are 700 million Indians that are under the age of 35.
The demographics are in India by far one of the most positive influences right now and also going forward. India will have the youngest population up to the year 2050, the largest working age population. In economic terms, that means a population between the ages of 15 and 64, and we will be in India the largest working age population of any country in the world.
It's no secret that India, moving into the 21st century, will assume a greater role globally. This is reflected in the country's evolving role in the G20.
I think India needs to play a much more public role in terms of leading the debates on these issues rather than playing just a background role, because I think the intellectual firepower that India can bring to these debates is very, very high, and we need to have more of a public role as well in terms of influencing and shaping these debates.
As its economic power increases, it will begin to play a more and more important role, and I think you're already starting to see that. India is chairing some of the subcommittees in the G20 process. Truthfully, the demographics and the growth in GDP, it makes it inevitable that power will shift more and more, and I think India is very well placed to grab that power and to make it itself an influential power in the world.
India has truly become an economic superpower, but it also means that the time has come now for India, and probably for other countries in Asia, not only India, to play its role in the global economic framework and in the global economic governance.
In the past 20 years, India has experienced extraordinary growth. The country's resilience and its people's pride and determination brings with it a promise of a brighter future.